almost like she knew she was being video.
She's like, I want to be on video. All right, let's go. Let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila. Didn't like that. Almost like she knew she was being video.
Happy holidays, Internet. I'm Brett Fisher, and I'm here for another weekly YouTube Live Ask Me Anything on DevOps stuff, Docker, Kubernetes, the cloud, everything in between. I'm glad you're here. This is my channel. We've actually moved my channel. I needed some help in understanding how YouTube works lately, so I learned that I basically needed to move from my old channel to this channel. So you might see me twice if you search around YouTube, and just be sure to look for my new channel, which has the words Docker and DevOps in them. So that's how you know this is the dedicated channel to all things Docker. And so today I'm going to try to wrap up some things for the year, try to sort of retrospect on 2018. I will be going on a nice little vacation right around the holidays this year, so I'm not sure how good my internet's going to be in the mountains of West Virginia. So hopefully I'll be able to stream to you from there, but if not, this might be the last one this year. So a few first things. I'm using brand new software. This could all end in tears, but I am trying out some new stuff called Wirecast from Telestream, which I've been a big fan of their other software. So I thought I would try this. So let me know in the comments how this works. How's the audio sound? Is it too loud? Is it too quiet? And as I go throughout today and we talk about your questions, definitely give me some feedback in the comments or in the live chat, just so that I know what to do with this software, because I've been using OBS. A lot of you ask questions about how I live stream and my setup. So I'm using a Canon camera. Audio too loud. I'm getting the audio too loud. All right, let me turn that down. So let's try this. Let's see if this is a little bit better. And it's hard to get right on YouTube because you can't test on YouTube. You can record locally and try it, but then things always seem to change when you go live on the internet. So there is no sort of test streaming server on YouTube. You just basically have to go live. So if you're a subscriber to this channel, you might have seen many hours ago this morning, early in the morning, me testing stuff, and I went live for about 2 seconds. At least one person noticed because somebody commented. So yeah, this is new software. It's got a whole new setup. Hopefully it'll allow me to have guests on the show and do live streaming with other people, and also do that on YouTube, and would be fancier than Google Hangouts, which obviously works, but this has got a lot more stuff to it. So let's talk about some news. Let's talk about the year and what happened in 2018, and the continued rise of Kubernetes as a dominant conversation in everybody's. It's hard to talk about containers and not talk about Kubernetes at some point, even if you're just starting out. So we got a lot of stuff to talk about, I guess, in that regard, especially now that KubeCon is over and DockerCon EU just finished up a couple weeks ago. So those are good things. So let me check the comments real quick. Yeah, okay, so thanks, James. Should get a compressor clipping a little. Yeah, so I actually have a software limiter and compressor all in this studio of software. but I'm still learning it. I literally just started using it a day ago. So I'm going to work all those details out. I couldn't get it working the way I liked before I went live, so I kind of just was winging it. So hopefully the audio is a little bit better now, and keep me posted if it sucks because I'm still an amateur. So I do everything on software. Because this setup is mobile and I try to stream from wherever I'm at. I don't have the ability to take a bunch of dedicated hardware with me. So it's really just my laptop, my Canon camera, maybe this microphone, maybe a lav mic, a small little mic with me. So you'll see me like at DockerCon. I did a live streaming just using my iPhone and a nice Rode lavalier mic, which is those little mics you put on your shirts. And those actually worked really well in that setup. So it was something I could carry in my backpack and stream from there as long as the wireless was working. So, all right, let's get started with some stuff. Hopefully you like my background, the holiday idea. My wife and I worked on that the last couple of days. If you're interested in other things, DevOps, and especially containers, there's another channel here on YouTube called Containerizers, and we streamed yesterday on that. We talked for 2 hours about DockerCon, Kubernetes versus Swarm, the evolution of DockerCon, like how it's changed over the 5 years and how we've gone in the industry from just one major conference, which was DockerCon, to now hundreds of conferences that all have a container track. We've got Kubernetes conference, KubeCon, that's also the Cloud Native Con. We've got other conferences that basically are just conferences. Container Conf is actually a series of conferences. DevOps Days covers lots of conferences. DevOps Days around the world covers lots of container stuff. So obviously you've got lots of conferences now talking containers, but it all really started with DockerCon. And DockerCon is now, in the U.S., it's over 6,000 people. But surprisingly, this year, KubeCon was now over 8,000 people, and they're expecting 12,000 next year at KubeCon. So it's interesting to think that the landscape for containers has changed so much in just 6 short years, and we are now, I think, as an industry, moving beyond the basics of what is a container and going to a conference to learn how that works. Now we're moving on to stuff like the orchestrator and focusing really on that, because my understanding about KubeCon is that most people there are operators, whereas a lot of the stuff you get at DockerCon is for developers. But it's an interesting change in audience from it being developer focused at first and then moving into operations now that we have all this focus around orchestration and getting multiple servers all set up in Docker and Kubernetes. So so get your questions in. The way it works is I'll be working through the questions top to bottom, and I actually need to change my chat here to live chat. And let's see.
It's better now. The syncing is better.
So let's talk about some stuff. All right, real quick, I'm going to go through some announcements. Let's do this. Hopefully my audio is a little bit better. All right, let's see how this audio is. Because I was having problems with this audio before we went live, and it was acting funny on me. All right. Maybe a little hot. Okay. Always seems to be audio on Mac. That's the problem. All right, so we've got my URL for all things Docker and DevOps. So brettfisher.com/Docker. That is this URL. In case you've not been to any of my courses, I sell my course coupons there for super cheap. And then a whole bunch of other stuff, including videos from DockerCon, especially if you're interested in Swarm, and other stuff that I work on or projects that I help, like the one I started this year, which is called, let's see if I can find it, Dog versus Cat, which is my sort of sample repository for all things Swarm in production. And there's a couple of other good examples of those showing up on GitHub nowadays, but I started mine early this year, and it's basically a whole lot of configuration and setup for how you would do a swarm with all the bells and whistles, all the features, right? This is using all free open source software. Obviously, if you buy something like Docker Enterprise, that is got all the bells and whistles built in, right? But if you use the open source stuff, you don't. So this helps solve some of those gaps, and it goes through examples. And I updated the README recently so that there's more examples that you can walk through, including storage for persistent storage. You've got traffic in there for reverse proxy with a bunch of setup. I made some big updates on traffic lately. So now what it does is it not only uses Let's Encrypt for every website you throw into your swarm automatically to get certificates that work on the internet. It now adds in some stuff like it puts traffic on the host NIC so that it gets the real client IPs instead of using the overlay networks on Swarm. It will use the raw Ethernet NIC on the host, and then it'll use the overlays to pass the traffic back to your containers in the backend. So that's a big plus. And then we now have a proxy in place that actually uses HA proxy to take the Docker socket and put it over an encrypted private network so that the traffic front-end proxy can talk to the swarm without having to be on the managers, which is a big deal to me. In operations, I really want to run as little as possible on my operation management platform. In Swarm, those are called managers. And they run the RAF database. They run all the decisions around how your orchestration is going to work. And so that setup is all in a single YAML file for the proxy. So if you go under stack proxy global here, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff in here, a bunch of containers, including some global mode containers. And this will make sure that you have your proxy running on multiple hosts, and you can set it up so that it never runs on managers, and that you only run this little tiny socket proxy that uses HA proxy along with some filters to actually prevent any your proxy from actually getting any access to secrets or anything it shouldn't on your network. So it actually locks stuff down and increases the security a little bit of your setup. So that was a big thing I worked on this month. So go check that out if you haven't. Something else I want to talk about is a wonderful newsletter that I recommend. So a lot of people ask me, hey, Brett, you got a newsletter, you got some courses, but maybe you've got some other recommendations for other people's stuff. And so what I would recommend first, if you're focused on DevOps in general, not just containers, is that Chris Short, who is a CNCF ambassador for that's the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. He's an ambassador for them. He also works in the Red Hat and Ansible groups, I believe. And he's got a really great newsletter that he's been doing for quite some time. I think he just celebrated, 100 newsletters. And he's got, just this week, he talked about KubeCon, and I love the fact that they have this KubeCon as in Star Trek Con, if you're a Star Trek geek. And that's pretty great. And so he's got some examples of what his newsletter has in it, and you can read through the newsletters, but you can get it in your inbox. So if you just go to devopsish.com, you can sign up for his newsletter. He doesn't know that I'm doing this, that I'm putting it on the internet. But it's a cool setup. So let me put this in chat. So I've been reading that for a while now, and it's so much stuff. He actually sends them out every Sunday, and you could spend hours reading all the links. And it's a lot of good updates from around the container and cloud native community for DevOps. Got my morning coffee. All right, so we're going to get to the questions real quick. Let me jump back over to my full screen here. All right. Good morning, everyone. Instead of saying hi to everyone, I'm just going to jump to the questions real quick because we've got some other stuff to talk about later if we have a chance to get to it. I want to give you some demos on some of the stuff announced at DockerCon in case you haven't seen it. So we'll get to some questions real quick. Valmisi says, hello, I have a scenario. I will use Ansible for the deployment of the service, so I'll provide a Docker leader node IP in the host file, what if during the deployment leader is down and another manager elected as leader? If so, is it possible for Ansible to detect and switch to the other manager in order to do deployment? Okay, so I believe you're talking about Swarm, and you're asking if you have Ansible talking to Swarm and you're using the Docker API, what about management failover? So the answer is you don't have to worry about it. On Swarm, the leader and the other managers are all, let me say that, assuming the node is still up, you don't have to worry about it. So if you're dedicating the IP, right, if you're going into Ansible and you're setting up a hard-coded IP for one node to talk to, first off, you probably shouldn't do that, but we'll get to that in a second. What you can do there is that any manager automatically redirects API calls to the proper node that is the leader. So whether you're doing Docker CLI or Docker API calls, as long as you're talking to a node that's a manager and it's working, if it's not the leader, it'll still shoot over, it basically redirects all of the commands over to the proper server. So you don't have to worry about that. But in the real world, what I think you probably need to worry about is not hard coding IPs, because this infrastructure should be disposable. You should be able to throw away nodes and pick them right back up and with new ones. So a lot of times in AWS, for example, what we'll recommend is using elastic IPs for at least one, if not all of the managers. And you really shouldn't have more than 5 managers, even in the largest of infrastructures. Again, you don't get more capacity with more managers, you just get more failure capacity. So as long as you have 3 nodes, you always have at least one node can fail. If you have 5 nodes that are managers, 2 nodes can fail, and so on. Most of the time, no one needs to really design for 3 different nodes failing and have that kind of level of capacity, because that's pretty rare. Usually if you have an entire zone go down, an availability zone, it'll just take down that one manager on that zone, and that's fine. So anyway, I digress. In that case, what you want is elastic IPs so that whenever you bring up the new manager, it gets the same IP address. And that if you set that up properly in AWS, then you won't have to ever change the IPs. What I recommend is using Route 53 DNS, setting up your Ansible to use a DNS name, and having that DNS name point to an elastic IP that points at all the managers in an auto-scaling group. Now that's a lot of AWS terminology, but you can set up a similar infrastructure in Azure, I believe. It's just going to be called the different things, right? So you probably want to design it that way instead of hard coding the IP in. But again, if you're hard coding an IP, even if it's not the leader, it doesn't really matter. The goal is in Swarm is that you never have to care about which one is the leader. So I don't ever have to care, at least. I never really look at it because it may change all the time, just depending on network conditions and which server responds the fastest. So, all right, good question. On to the next one. Juan says, what is the best course to learn AWS and not too expensive? I would look right here on Udemy. I don't have a recommended course because I haven't taken any AWS courses. So if you're looking for a course, I'd say look here on Udemy for highly rated, at least 4.5 or higher courses on AWS. And if you can find one of those, it's probably a good choice. I know that a lot of the ones here on Udemy focus on certifications. Those may or may not be good for you. It just depends on your level of expertise and whether you want to go for certification. The other place to look is LinkedIn Learning. That's a good place, as well as Pluralsight. So I don't have any specific course recommendations on those, but good luck finding those. And I'm sure there's something good in one of those 3 places on the internet. Eric, hello. Currently using Docker Swarm. Is there a reason to move to Kubernetes, or is the gap of features between the 2 closing and it'd be all right to stay with Swarm? All right. So the Swarm versus Kubernetes is an excellent discussion, but it's very tailored to you and your needs. It's the same as saying, should you write in PHP or JavaScript? Or should you use AWS or Azure? Or should you use Ansible or Puppet or Ansible and Terraform? Like, there's all these infrastructure choices, that it's hard for me to know what your unique setup is and what your requirements are. I see several things happening in the industry. Not all of them are rational, right? We don't always make choices based on features. And we probably always shouldn't make choices based on features. Features is certainly one of the things you need to care about. I would say first, is Swarm working for you, right? Swarm and Kubernetes have a healthy amount of users using both of them. Right now, everyone on the internet particularly loves to talk about Kubernetes because there's so much activity going on in that space. Swarm is not adding features as much. There's actually, if you look over the pace of the not even 2.5 years that it's existed, most of the big features were in the first year and a half. And then over the last year, Swarm has been focused mostly on scalability and performance, which has improved dramatically in some cases. And so Docker's, the Docker Enterprise Edition, the paid version of Docker, most of those people run Swarm. In fact, all of Visa, this is what I'm told, all of Visa, or maybe not all of Visa, but Visa, the credit card company, and PayPal both used Swarm for their Black Friday transactions. So if you made any purchases on the internet or with a credit card around Black Friday, you were technically processed by something somewhere in there you were processing using Swarm. I'm sure there's Kubernetes in that mix too, right? Because Kubernetes is getting a lot of popularity. So I would say that especially DigitalOcean, they did a survey recently that showed that the amount of people under 5 people in the team, so a smaller team of people or a smaller set of servers, the increase in Swarm was actually, the use of Swarm was actually increasing more than it has in the past. And so if you look at certain other areas, obviously like AWS, where maybe you would have a larger, more complicated infrastructure, definitely more people there are using Kubernetes than using Swarm. So it really kind of depends on where you are and your team size and your infrastructure complexity. Knowing both of them and talking to a lot of different customers and my own clients, I would recommend usually, without knowing your infrastructure, you learn and start with Swarm first. And it sounds like you've already done that and you're happy with Swarm. If Swarm works for you and it's getting the job done, there's no reason to switch. Kubernetes requires more effort and more infrastructure to deploy and manage than Swarm does. So it's got a lot more in it out of the box, right? You run Swarm and it's just using the Docker daemon on a host. It's just a part of the default Docker install. But Kubernetes usually requires at least a dozen or more containers just to have it. And usually you need some sort of infrastructure tool or infrastructure management just to make it sort of manageable. Now that's great when you're needing the complexity of Kubernetes. You're going to have to accept that burden, or either use something like EKS or DigitalOcean's Kubernetes to manage it for you. You can also use Rancher or Docker Enterprise to manage that for you as well. So those tools help deploy and manage the infrastructure of Kubernetes, keep it secure and all that. Because security with Kubernetes is important. It doesn't necessarily come out of the box completely locked down. So you definitely need to focus on that if you're going to use it. What I do see people doing now is they're using Swarm for simpler workloads, web services, long-running tasks that they just need to deploy in an easy infrastructure. They then maybe use Kubernetes for things that either don't fit in the Swarm model or maybe are specifically designed for Kubernetes, or are something like a job, like a cron system where Swarm doesn't yet have a baked-in job system yet. There's some ways you can make stuff work, and I actually give some examples in my dog versus cat example that I showed you earlier. But Kubernetes is one of those places where jobs and sort of the cron one-off kind of things are a first-class citizen, and those come out of the box. So you might consider doing that. But running both obviously adds more complexity and it's more work. So you definitely want to have a team of people to manage all this stuff, not just one person. So when I hear from people that they're just one DevOps person and that they're the person that manages all their servers and their DevOps infrastructure, then I always recommend Swarm first. Because if they can get away with Swarm, if they can make that work, it's going to save them so much more time and money potentially than managing a Kubernetes infrastructure. The simple answer is that Swarm is designed for developers. Kubernetes is designed for operators. So when you look at the Swarm workflow and how you get from your local machine into Swarm using stack files, YAML compose files, that all makes a lot of sense for a developer. Swarm is easy to set up and manage, so that's easier for a developer who's maybe not a full-time sysadmin. Kubernetes, on the other hand, is ideal for operators like me. It has all the knobs and bells and whistles that you would need to have a highly complex infrastructure that's very flexible and does all the things you need it to do in a large system. If you have only dozens of containers, I would do my best to try to make it work in Swarm, because Kubernetes is a lot of infrastructure to just run a couple dozen containers. I would probably try to stay in Swarm as long as I could, and then consider Kubernetes if for some reason I couldn't get it working in Swarm. A great example might be if you're a Jenkins Enterprise paid customer. I believe that the way that CloudBees, the company that runs and creates Jenkins, the way that they tell you to deploy Jenkins Enterprise is on Kubernetes. They give you Helm charts, I believe, some deployment YAML, so that you can automatically set it up and deploy it their way in Kubernetes. They don't yet provide that for Swarm. So if you're a customer of theirs and you want to sort of set up their official infrastructure, you're going to need to focus on Kubernetes. So that's just one example. There's lots of ways to do it. We could talk about that forever, but it's a great topic, and I think that it's worth all of us, if you're focused on setting up servers and managing infrastructure, that you eventually learn both, so that you have multiple options in your tool bag, so that you can choose the right one for the right job. All right, great questions. We'll ask a couple more, and then I want to jump to a topic real quick. I want to show you Docker app. Ron is asking a question regarding a private Git server running in a Docker container. I work for a government agency, and they're highly sensitive about using something like GitHub. Image suggestion. That's an interesting point. Ron, the first thing I would suggest is look at GitLab. If you want a full-fledged GitHub-like experience, but you don't want to run it on the internet, you can always buy GitHub Enterprise, or you can use the free GitLab, which is very full-featured, has lots of stuff in it. You can run Git, the protocol, the command line Git. You can run it on anything. You can run it against a USB stick, a network file server. There's lots of ways that you can sync those files up with remote destinations. So it doesn't have to be an SSH server, because there's no such thing as that I'm aware of a Git server. What I think you mean is an SSH server or a web server that the Git command line can speak to, because Git doesn't necessarily have its own protocol, right? It's its own network protocol that I'm aware of. So it uses something like an SSH server that you can shoot SSH links through, or HTTPS for a web server. So I don't know of any of those sort of just using the native Git binary. I've never done that. If I've ever needed private Git stuff, I just do it over SSH. But that's usually just for me and maybe two other people. Once it gets to a larger team, then I want to look at something like GitHub Enterprise, which allows me to put GitHub in my local server data center and not depend on the internet. Or GitLab, which is a free version. It's almost like a superset clone of GitHub features with other stuff built in, like a container registry. And that is something that you can install locally in your enterprise, I believe. So check those out. Those would be my recommendations, and hopefully they'll work. Great question. Bala's asking, quick question on Swarm restart policy. What's the difference between window and delay parameter? So let me go to the command line real quick. Let's check that out. All right. Over here. Let's see. Let's actually go to the compose file. So for stack files, you can look, which are compose files. You can put all of the Swarm options in there. And when you look at restart policies, window, how long to wait before deciding if a restart has succeeded? So let me zoom in on that. Yeah, let's make that a little bigger. All right, restart policy. The window, how long to wait before deciding if a restart has succeeded? So there's your definition of what a window is. And What was the other one? And delay parameter. The delay, how long to wait between restart attempts specified as a duration. So there you go. So when a window is has the restart started working, all right, so that's the first thing. If you've ever done a sort of a restart, well, it's not really restarting anyway, right? Because it's Docker Swarm, so it's really spinning up a new task as a new container. So I would say that the window to wait before deciding for restart has succeeded. So when you restart or do a Swarm, Docker service update. If you do a Docker service update command, you'll notice at the very end of that, when it's processing, it'll say waiting to see if it's been successful, right? That's at the very end. Even if you restart a bunch of containers, it's going to wait at the very end to see if it's successful. And that, I believe, is the window. So after everything is restarted, let's say you have 10 replicas, after it's recreated all of those containers, how long to see if they're successful? And then the delay would be, let's see, how long to wait between restart attempts. So I would say that the difference here is the window may be related to a rollback or a failure state where this will basically prevent race conditions on the delay. So the delay would prevent you from creating a task, killing a task, creating a task, killing a task, that sort of thing over and over and over again. My Santa hat is falling off. So it'd be interesting to test. What I would say is you should test and see how they affect. And I have a repo for that. So if you haven't seen this one, it's over at github.com, Brett Fisher, brown coat. So I have this app, and I will put this in here for testing Swarm updates. So this repo is a web app that has various failures that you can force it to fail in certain ways and see how it behaves with the settings that you give your Swarm or your stack or your service, right? So it's got a bunch of examples in here. So check that out. There's actually, not on this channel, actually my old channel, I had a video on giving a demo of this. So you can probably just search Swarm updates at Brett Fisher, and you can probably find that video on YouTube. And I run through a bunch of this stuff. And I also talk about this stuff inside my Swarm course, in case you take Swarm Mastery a little bit. So, good question. Let's see. All right, before I go to some more questions, what I want to do real quick is give you a demo of something that I saw happen at DockerCon, and I'm not sure if you've seen it or not. So inside my dog versus cat, which is my Swarm setup, I now have a couple of new files, and they're .docker apps. And let me see. Let me actually let me make some more screen real estate here. 1 second. Okay, so let's look at Docker app. So Docker app is a new binary from Docker, and they launched it actually at DockerCon US, so that was 6 months ago, and then they updated it at DockerCon EU. So the updates at DockerCon EU were largely around this new announcement of a standard called CNAB, but that doesn't really change the way we use Docker app. And Docker app has multiple purposes, so I'm not going to cover all of its usages. I will put a link to it here in the chat so you can go check it out. But I'm going to show you for orchestration purposes and for ops-focused people, if you're one of those, It has an interesting use that I wanted to show off because you might want to check it out. So you have to install this separately. It actually talks to the Docker API, so it replaces the Docker command line for a few things. It also replaces Docker Compose for a few things, but it's meant to work with Compose files or stack files, same thing. And it allows you to actually talk to a Swarm or a Kubernetes cluster and do things with YAML, like deploying stacks. And one of the cool things it does is it lets you create these Docker app files. So the Docker app file is still YAML, and it's a little bit different than the Compose file, but it's compatible with the Compose file. So think of it as a superset of what you get out of a Compose file. In fact, if I go into my voting app, which is a distributed multi-tier app that you've probably seen me give examples before, Docker uses it as an example all the time. And if I just scroll down and I looked right here, it would look just like a regular Compose file. We would have our services and all of our settings for our different apps, the database, the Redis, the voting, and all that. But up at the top, what you'll notice is a new section, and this is metadata about the Compose file itself. So I get to version my Compose file, almost like you would version your app, right? But an app is usually in one image, so you would have tags to describe each of your app commits. But how do you deal with that on your Compose file? It's always been a weird issue where, as a DevOps person, I really want to make sure that all of my servers have the same YAML deployed into their stacks. There's never really been a good way to do that. So usually we're doing something like either changing the name of the file, which is a horrible idea, or we set labels maybe to sort of figure out which stack file we're using. Maybe we use a commit ID and we store the YAML in a GitHub repository. Anyway, there's never really been a clear way to do that. And we've never been able to easily deploy YAML inside of a Docker image, right? It's always been the app, but not the YAML file that's in the image. And that's changed with Docker app. So now one of the things that Docker app does is it, one, allows me to specify this metadata, and the namespace is my organization on Docker Hub, or just in my registry. And then the name is so you can think of it as a repo name. So think of this app as potentially living now, this YAML file that has many images defined in it. It can now live on Docker Hub at Docker Hub /dog versus cat /voting. In fact, if I now go to Docker Hub, something they just released last week is a big refresh to Docker Hub. And if I go to my organization for dog versus cat, I think this works. Yeah. So this is an organization. Imagine it being a company, and it has containers, but beyond container images, you'll see this. So this is an image, and the only thing in it, there's no actual apps in this image. It's just the YAML that I specified over here. So the Docker app binary will package up that YAML, let me give it a version and an image tag, and then ship it up to Docker Hub to distribute the YAML file. So if you've ever asked yourself, how can I give other people, like I give them my images, how can I give them my Compose files? This is how you would do it. Everyone's always asked for a Docker Hub for Compose files. This is how you do it. It turns out that Docker Hub is the place that you would put those Compose files now. And they just updated Docker Hub to make this visually so we can see it. You could actually do this before a week ago, but you couldn't go find it in the web GUI. It was still there. You could push and pull it, but you couldn't really see it in the web GUI until recently. So now, if I were to do something like Docker app, which is the command line for this, because I've installed it. So Docker app, and then I can do a push, and I would push this image just like I would a regular image, but instead of it pushing the app, it would push the Compose file. That way I can tell my friends or my clients or whoever needs to deploy this multi-tier app, I can say, you go to Docker app and you would use deploy just like you would use Docker stack deploy now. And they would use deploy and then define that image from Docker Hub. So they would do dog versus cat /voting like that. And as long as they use the right options here, you have to sort of give it a few other options. It would deploy to your cluster, including Kubernetes now, using that YAML file, and that's a pretty cool way. There's other benefits of using this Docker app where it will actually pull out your environment variables, and you could either keep those in the same YAML or put them in separate YAMLs and sort of break it out to make it easier to manage in a team your different settings for different environments. And then another thing it does is it works with Helm charts. So if you want to turn a compose file into a Helm chart, it'll help you do that. And it's got actually a few other uses that I don't even quite understand yet because it's trying to solve some of the operational problems at a higher level of abstraction than we've previously had. So I encourage you to go check it out. You actually have to download the binary manually and copy it on your system. So it's not included at all with any of the Docker installs. I encourage you to go check that out, as well as my examples in the dog versus cat repo. So if you jumped over to dog versus cat on GitHub, you would see that I have several Docker app files in there. And let's see if I have... let's see if I have any examples. I'm not sure if I have the examples documented yet for using the Docker app. Yeah, so this is just examples of using Docker Stack Deploy. So I don't yet have those examples in there, but you should be able to read the documentation for Docker app and figure out the command lines from the command itself, because it'll actually tell you great stuff if you just do Docker app deploy help, and then you get options there. So the way this works in Kubernetes, you might be asking, is how does this talk to Kubernetes? And that's another thing they open sourced at DockerCon was let's see, Compose on Kubernetes. So Compose on Kubernetes is a container image that runs as an API and translates stack files into Compose deployments, all the different Compose objects, all the different container objects you would need and networking objects you would need inside of a Kubernetes cluster. So you can imagine that you're going to have deployments, replica sets, services, all the different things that you're going to create inside of a Kubernetes cluster. You can use now the Compose files to do that. Maybe you don't want to use Helm charts, because technically Helm charts, the Compose file actually would sit at a higher level of abstraction than a Helm chart. So you might want to check this out if you're really into using Docker Compose locally and you would like to continue using that in Kubernetes, because you know you can use it in Swarm with Swarm stacks. But for the longest time now, we haven't had the ability to use those Compose files with Kubernetes. And now Docker has released the open source components for this. They actually use this in Docker Desktop today. That's how you can use Docker Stack Deploy today with Kubernetes on your desktop and with Docker Enterprise. So previously, this was only something you could get if you installed the Docker tools. But now you can actually deploy this on your own on Amazon or anything else. So I believe there's actually documentation in here on how to get this started, in like AKS, if you wanted to use on Azure's Kubernetes service. This tells you how to set up this so you can use Compose files with Kubernetes in Azure. So it's kind of crazy. It's a lot of different technologies in there, but hopefully you'll check all that out. So let's jump back to the questions and see what else we've got. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes left on the YouTube Live, so I want to make sure we get everybody's questions answered as much as we can. Thanks for all the feedback, everyone. Hello, Josh. Thanks for the feedback on the audio. Yeah, I'm definitely going to spend more time in the next week perfecting the gain on that and locking it down, doing some testing offline. So thanks. All right. One limitation I've come across with Docker Swarm Overlay Network is that you lose the original client IP other than the host mode. Do you know a third-party driver that mitigates this? So, Jorn, hopefully that's semi-correct on your name. Hopefully I'm getting close. Jorn, so with my dog versus cat example, that is one of the things this does with traffic. So it turns out you have all the drivers built in that you need to do this. Overlay is just the default driver in Swarm. You can use the host driver, you can use the bridge driver, you can use the Mac VLAN driver if you're in a data center. And so what you would do is, in this case, I give you an example in this setup, and I put some documentation and comments in here to help you figure it out. But what this does here, if you look down at the networks, you'll see that I create several networks. All of them are overlay, but on the traffic, which is my proxy, in this case my proxy is traffic, you'll see that my ports here, I have target mode host. So let me see if I can zoom that in and you can see that. So this is a recent update. This has actually only happened in the last 8 months or so, but you can now publish ports in a container, and a replicated container service. And you can set the mode instead of ingress mode, which uses the ingress routing, which is what you're concerned about, which is changing the client IP behind NAT. You just set it to host mode, and then that container replica set gets the dedicated ports on the host from the raw NIC. So they get a boost in performance, which, it may not matter. It's probably 5 or 10% maybe at the most. So it's not a huge gain or anything, and most people wouldn't notice it. But if you need that, there you go. And then it changes it so that you get the raw client IPs coming in. So hopefully that helps you. I would say experiment with that. You can use that with any container. Obviously, in a Swarm, you can only dedicate each port to one service, right? Because it's going to use that real IP and port on the host IP. So check that out. Turns out it was all built in all along. You didn't need a third-party driver. Let's see. Thanks, Ron. This is my special Christmas mug from my wife. This is the drinking from a reindeer's head. Biker is back. To achieve UCP Layer 7 routing, dynamically edits the agent to add new and changed website names to the Nginx config file, then restarts the agent on all servers. Seems rather clunky to me. Is traffic better? So yes, traffic doesn't actually restart every time you change it. Traffic was designed from the ground up to be a sort of container native dynamic cloud proxy. We can debate around whether Nginx is faster or better. A lot of people do performance and comparisons, but I would certainly check out traffic. It's got a lot of advantages over just a raw Nginx. Normally, if you're going to use Nginx as your proxy in a cluster, you're going to need something else around it. You're going to need another tool that wraps it. And it doesn't necessarily have to restart Nginx. It can do a hup that basically tells Nginx to pull in its config file instead of completely restarting the container. You can have it update the binary without restarting it. So that's possible. It actually just depends on the tool you're using around Nginx, because Nginx itself doesn't just automatically do that. With traffic has a lot of that stuff out of the box. It's designed to automatically consume updates, and it actually consumes them from the API of Docker or Kubernetes. It doesn't just look at a config file on the hard drive, right? It actually can talk to APIs automatically. That's a built-in feature. Another thing it has is Let's Encrypt right out of the box. So it can go and grab certificates for new services that you install or deploy, rather. It can go and grab those certificates from Let's Encrypt without a separate service. And so it makes it a lot easier, I think, in terms of setup. It's not perfect in every situation. It doesn't do caching. It doesn't do web serving. I mean, it's a proxy only. It doesn't do other things like Nginx does. So it won't just serve static files like Nginx will. But it's certainly a great, I think, up-and-coming front-end proxy, and a lot of people are using it. So yeah, certainly check that out. Do you know of a way to limit which containers can talk to each other on the same overlay? So no, the answer to that, Jorn, is you make more overlays. So overlays are free and unlimited. You can make as many as you want. So if you need to limit and control that access, it's a many relationship. So you can have many containers on one overlay or many overlays connected to one container. And so you would and you can do that without restarting the containers, right? So you basically can connect them to new networks. Although, and now that I think about that, in Swarm, will it automatically redeploy the tasks? Now that I think about it, it actually will redeploy the tasks. You can connect a regular Docker run container without restarting the container. But I think in Swarm, it's going to redeploy the container tasks with the new networks. So in your case, if you need to segment that, just create more overlays. And it's a little weird of a concept, especially if you're like me, an old hat networking person where you're used to doing routes and firewalls. But that's how you do it in overlay. If you need something more advanced, then you're going to need to do something, a different driver. Maybe WeaveNet will do it. I'm not sure if WeaveNet has firewalls. It might have that. So you can check out Weave, which is a third-party networking driver that works in Swarm. All right. Ron says, thanks. I'm aware of GitLab and have played with it some. May look at that for the long-term solution. For a proof of concept, it is a bit resource intensive for our current budget. Yeah, definitely, Ron. There's a lot of stuff in GitLab, so you might be able to turn off some of the stuff. I'm not positive on that. If you can turn off some of the features you don't necessarily need, but yeah, it's definitely more than an SSH server. But honestly, if you really need the simplest thing and everyone's just command line, then just set up an SSH server. There's lots of tutorials on how to set up Git over SSH. And then just make sure that whatever storage is behind that SSH server is being backed up, and then look for guides on how to run SSHD in a container. And then there you go. You've got sort of your Git server that you can use with SSH. I mean, originally Git was only for SSH. It was HTTPS came later, at least in my memory, it did. So check that out if you want a super lightweight setup. But you got to make sure that those files are backed up and on a volume somewhere, not in the container itself, because then otherwise you'll lose them when the container gets replaced. So let's see. Oh, thanks. Is my hat messed up? It keeps lighting off. So Biker's asking, Biker's saying, is Docker app supported in Docker Trusted Registry? So as far as I know, Biker, I haven't tried it with DTR, but I don't see why Docker app wouldn't work. It has login just like Docker does, so you should be able to log into a private registry and check that out. I'm sure there's going to be some limitations because it definitely is beta quality software. But actually, does it have login? Maybe it doesn't have login. That's a good question. I recommend testing it for me, and because I don't have a DTR sitting in front of me, but I'd love to hear your feedback. Check that out and let me know if it works. It might even say something in the documentation. So I can tag and push voting.docker app the same way I tag push the image. Yes, definitely. Are there performance differences with different network drivers? Is Mac VLAN faster than overlay? So yes, every network driver on any orchestrator is going to have different performance benefits, different feature benefits. Mac VLAN, so the fastest one would be host, because that is removing any extra layers of networking technology. And let's be clear, all the different default drivers out of the box, they're just using Linux kernel features. They're just using, VXLAN features is what overlay uses. But VXLAN for overlay, it's simulating essentially a VLAN, and that's a native feature out of the Linux kernel. But what it does is it re-encapsulates the packets inside UDP packets. So yes, definitely there's a performance cost there. It's been around for a long time, so it's pretty efficient. But and in the last couple of years, actually, Docker's made it even faster because the way they've implemented it. But I would say Mac VLAN is a special case because it's bare metal performance, but it's giving an IP per container instead of the host driver, which just uses the raw NIC, and you don't get multiple IPs. You just get that dedicated host IP. The problem with host is that you're basically giving the container complete access to the whole NIC on the server, so it reduces your security a little bit. The problem with Mac VLAN is Mac VLAN can usually not be used in the cloud because Mac VLAN gets an IP from your real network DHCP and gives it to each container. And that is really cool in a data center, but I don't know any cloud hoster that supports just giving you a bunch of IPs like that. So you would need to do something else in a cloud provider. I think Joyent, there might be another one, but Joyent is one of the few that I know of that automatically gives in Swarm or in Docker natively that automatically gives like a Docker container. Like if you did a Docker container run something, I think Joint as a hoster is one of the only ones I know of that gives a dedicated IP to each container that launches by default out of the box. If you're using Kubernetes, Kubernetes has different drivers, different networking options, and you have to pick one. And by default, it will use NAT, but it will give an IP address to each container and expect them all to be able to be on the same network. So the networking is different between the two, but essentially you kind of have to go and research what you're doing. The default of overlay is the easy button in Swarm. It just works out of the box, but it does it does give you that. I don't know, depending on what you're doing and what you're trying to do, it's probably anywhere between 3 and 10% of performance penalty at least, just depending on how many packets you're doing and all that. So I would say that on web services and web sites and that sort of stuff, none of my customers, the people I talk to, they notice a difference. There's lots of people using it with overlay, but then when people get really, really big systems and they need that top end performance, then they might disable that and go for host mode if they're in the cloud and use the host NIC. But I'll be honest, at that point, what I would probably do is still try to use overlay, and I would just try to get 10 gigabit networking on my servers. I would try to put a whole bunch of containers on a few servers. Instead of having a bunch of small servers, I'd use fewer, bigger servers and try to get 10 gigabit networking. That way, that 3 to 10% doesn't really matter because I've got more high-end traffic on the top there to handle the packets. So anyway, hopefully that helps. And you're saying in Azure there is a private network 10 and those addresses are fixed, but I don't know if they associate to a fixed MAC. Yeah, in Azure you're going to have subnets, but you don't normally have the ability to give a single VM in the cloud, let's say 50 IP addresses, right? That the cloud is giving it through DHCP. That's usually not a thing they do. You can obviously assign like elastic IPs or extra NICs. You can add extra different subnets, but that's not the same thing. So I don't know how you would make Mac VLAN work in the cloud. I've not seen anyone do it. It may be possible in some way. I've just never seen it done yet. It's usually for data centers where you are running legacy apps and you're running a swarm where you need, you have a networking engineer and they're assigning, the DHCP scopes on your network and they have control of all that. And then you just put all of your hosts in the data center on the same subnet. And when you create your Mac VLAN networking, you give it basically a range of IPs and it goes and it uses DHCP to get those. And then every container gets a real IP address on the real data center network, which works well for legacy legacy apps that maybe can't do NAT or published ports. So yeah, check that out. All right, so it's been over an hour. I thank you so much for coming again. I do this every week. You can get all my resources and links to stuff, including my free content and my paid content, all at brettfisher.com/Docker. And I thank you for joining me and have a happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I will see you soon live on YouTube.